Hello and welcome back to a jubilant Pondering Papaya podcast with a look back at the Australian Grand Prix. Joining me to discuss Lando's podium and Oscar's P4 in front of his home crowd is F1 journalist Rory Mitchell and DNF1 podcast host Adam Burns. So let's get into it. So joining me now, as promised, is Rory and Adam. Thanks to both you chaps for joining. How are you? I mean, to give you a bit of context to the listener, it's currently 11 a.m. UK time. I mean, it's some very tired eyes. I mean, Adam, how was it for you to start off? How was the race?
Well, again, I'm going to be aware of the space that I'm currently in, but given it was a very early start, I'm so glad that I got up for that one. It was a great race all round, and but more importantly, a great result for McLaren as well. So, everyone's happy at the moment.
Yeah, very true. Like I said, we will get on. And for a bit more context, Adam is wearing a Ferrari shirt. You may have guessed that. But we will get onto them a bit later on. Rory, how about you? How did you find the race overall? I mean, we'll get onto McLaren a bit, but sort of just the general vibe. What was your take?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good. I concur with Adam. I mean, it was worth getting up for. You know, it's not often you see a Red Bull catch fire. Verstappen, obviously he had to retire from the race, so that sort of, you knew instantly then it was going to be a different result to the rest of them, to the last 9 races. So yeah, it was good. It was good to.
Yeah, you're right to point out. It was a bit like, I don't know, like when you see like a superhero like suddenly get hurt, you're like, oh my god, I forgot this was possible. Like we've had 2 years. I think it was Australia 2022 when he last retired mechanically, and yeah, it was just a bizarre sight to see a Red Bull in trouble, because we've seen pretty much every other team have issues, but not Red Bull. But anyway, I digress. We as Adam mentioned, but I think both of you mentioned as well, great day for McLaren. I mean, podium for Norris, Piastri in P4. So sort of take you through their race to begin with. Norris started P4, pretty good qualifying. I think that was probably the best McLaren were expecting. The Red Bulls and the Ferraris looked a step ahead, other than Perez. But yeah, Piastri in P5, but a little bit different race strategies. But I think that was more to do with those around him. So Piastri pitted first in on lap 9, went from the medium to the hard. But if you look at George Russell, who was obviously very close to Piastri, he pitted a lap early, and I think McLaren were just worried about the undercut. So they get Piastri in, and what eventually occurs is that Piastri ends up being ahead of Norris because, as I said, the undercut was very powerful. We saw that Piastri move ahead of Norris, but eventually Norris re-overtook, and it just seemed like Norris was always the quicker of the two drivers. We'll get onto Piastri in a bit because he had a little bit of an off, but it wasn't overly major. But Roy, if I start with you, what did you make of Norris? Because it was another very good drive, up to 14 podiums now, which is obviously a huge number. I mean, he's still waiting for that first win, but 14 podiums is nothing to sniff at.
Yeah, he's got that unwanted statistic, hasn't he? Most podiums without a win. I think Nick Heidfeld is second on the list, so he's got to try and bump himself off it and hand it back to Nick. But yeah, I rode on board with Norris for the entire race, actually, through the app. You can do it, and it was quite interesting to hear, how much his engineer sort of coaches him sort of through the race, and how much they discussed the strategy. And it was pretty clear that they wanted to extend the first stint because they just felt the tyres were working basically as better than they thought it would. Probably it might have been a factor because the track temperature was the highest it's been all weekend, so a lot of the issues that they came across in practice probably weren't really affecting them as much. But yeah, I mean, he was when he pitted, he was 2.3 seconds behind Leclerc when he came out. So it looked like, had he have just pitted at the same time as Leclerc, he probably could have stayed ahead and maybe managed his race from there on in. So, but I thought, it was well managed from Norris, and yeah, a little bit different to what we've seen him do previous races.
Yeah, I think you're right to point that out. It was a very, I think you call it an assured drive, really. Like we've seen Norris get on the podium, obviously, as I mentioned, 14 times as well. But this was very much, he never looked in doubt. I mean, we've had a lot of times where he's sort of snuck in late, or he's done very well. He's done quick, and some patches look quite vulnerable. I'm thinking back to Silverstone last year, where obviously he was defending against Hamilton the whole time. But this one, it was very much a case he's third, he's staying third kind of thing. Adam, what did you make? And I just, another thing, I think that was a great point by Rory. Like, if you ever watch Lando's onboards, like, you will notice how his engineer is just constantly in his ear. I don't know if that's common. I think that's quite unlikely. I think some drivers prefer to have absolute zero radio communication, but for Norris, it's completely different. But anyway, Adam, what did you make of sort of Norris's overall race and sort of how he went about it?
I think it's a testament exactly as Rory said. And when you talk about the significance of the engineer being in your ear, maybe for Lando, that's the dynamic they have at McLaren that keeps him focused and keeps him on the job at hand. I mean, his consistency again was top notch. It's very easy to overlook that when you're focusing on the headline story, which is, of course, the Ferraris and Carlos Sainz having a mega job today. But Lando's consistency and putting the pace on and putting the pressure on Ferrari when he had to really did keep McLaren at the hunt. It was almost at a point where you thought, could McLaren challenge for the win here? I mean, maybe that was not overly realistic, but I think it just shows how good McLaren were today. And more importantly, how consistent not only Lando, but Oscar as well. Very, very solid drives. There would have been a lot of pressure to deliver when that golden opportunity came up with Verstappen having issues and Perez being practically nowhere. But fair play to both McLarens. They did a great job. And Lando especially really getting that podium, I think it was thoroughly deserved.
Yeah, good score points. Will Joseph was the name. I quickly looked up. That's Lando's race engineer. It escaped me previously, but that's the guy who goes, who's in Lando's ear most of the time. If you mentioned Ferrari there, do we think? I'll come to you, Rory, on this one. Do we think they were ever really catchable, beatable, or do you think they were just a step ahead the whole race? Really?
I mean, Norris, I think it was Norris said on Friday that they would be very tough, like they're in a different league, them and Red Bull. So it's tough, really. I mean, I looked at the times just before we did this, and Norris was sort of in there or thereabouts. It's the sort of sporting phrase I can use there. But yeah, it's tough. I think it's one for the team to probably look at and analyse, because if he, as you say, if he could have, stayed ahead of Leclerc or even catched him, the win could have been on for all their, they would have known.
Yeah, it definitely looked like that to begin with when Verstappen went out, because obviously it was, I think at one point it was Sainz and then Norris and then Leclerc. So yeah, there was definitely possibility. Like, I think the team have been quite realistic, haven't they, for pretty much since the season started. I think they all accept that Ferrari's definitely still a step ahead. I mean, Red Bull again. I say Red Bull, but let's just say Verstappen, because Perez showed that he's not always as quick as his teammate. Verstappen and Ferrari are still a step ahead. So yeah, a P3 is probably where they're expecting. If we move on to Piastri, I mean, it's a good finish, but do you think, Adam, he might be a little bit disappointed? Because obviously he did have the better pit strategy to begin with, and then obviously he had that little off. It wasn't a huge off, but it was still enough sort of to make sure he wasn't getting anywhere close to Norris. Do you think he'd be a little bit disappointed, A, not to get that podium, but B, also in front of a passionate home crowd that was there?
I think on that element, he will be disappointed that he didn't get a podium. I think when they look back at the data and look at how the race panned out, I mean, again, jumping on Rory's point that he earlier made, the question would have been how much further could McLaren have gone? And in Piastri's case, he would have thought about that too. But that early pit stop for George Russell by Mercedes instigated Piastri's stop, instigated Leclerc's pit stop, and it changed the race for those guys where Norris and Sainz, of course, had that advantage of those fresher tyres in that middle stint. And that's what created the buffer and the gap between the two. And I think even although Oscar will be disappointed that he wasn't able to get the podium at home, and I'm sure the Aussie fans would be too, we saw the groans and the sighs when they did that switch. But McLaren played that strategy perfectly, and they were fighting Perez. I don't think they were thinking about Ferrari at that point in time. They knew Lando had that tyre offset advantage. And let's be honest, Piastri inherited that position from Lando from that earlier undercut. So it would have been very unfair for McLaren to not expect to give Lando that place back, especially when he had the tyre and pace advantage in the middle and final stints of the race.
Yeah, I think we all maybe give a bit too much credit to what the fans want. I think obviously you'd be hard pressed to find a single person within that grandstand that didn't want Piastri ahead of Norris, but ultimately McLaren would have looked at that. They would have said Norris is not only quicker in this race, but you'd think he's a quicker driver overall currently as it stands, and sort of that makes more sense. Just had a quick look at the table. I mean, it's very interesting. Obviously, these two drivers, they happen to be the closest drivers together, ignoring the guys who haven't scored points yet, because obviously they're very close. So yeah, you've got Piastri still just ahead on 28 points, Norris on 27, and McLaren doing very well compared to where they were this time last year. Roy, what have you made of their start so far? Because I think a lot of people, myself included, went in with a lot of hype with McLaren. I was touting them for a P2. Could still happen, but I think they've sort of been a little bit of a step back, whereas they look quite good here. Like, that's basically my long way winded of saying, what have you made of McLaren? Because I think I'm still a bit confused with what they are.
Yeah, I think Ferrari and Red Bull have just made the steps over the winter that they haven't been able to do. And as you say, like towards the end of last year, they were sort of in the running for the wins sometimes. Like I think it was Brazil where Lando was overtook briefly Verstappen for the lead, and yeah, I think they've. It's not been the start that they probably hoped in terms of regular podiums, challenging regularly for podiums. But you look at sort of broader picture, they're still ahead of Aston Martin and the sort of best of the rest. So I think it was always going to be difficult to beat Ferrari because they were building a car that was designed to make it easier for their drivers, and they've sort of succeeded in that. And Red Bull's just got that ridiculous advantage. So yeah, I think it's worked out okay for them in the end. But I think they probably expected these podiums to come more naturally.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, you're right to sort of bring up Ferrari and sort of their development pattern. If we look at last year, like I think Ferrari pretty much halfway through the year admitted their car had a ceiling and like they just couldn't do any more with it. Whereas McLaren's design this year looks obviously very similar to what they had last year. So you do expect there'd be less potential for them to gain less improvements than Ferrari, who obviously go into a massively more different strategy. Thinking ahead, we've got Suzuka next, and we're just sort of looking at it. It's again quite a quick track, so you should think that McLaren would do well. I mean, Adam, I appreciate it's a few weeks off, and we're still sort of in the aftermath of Melbourne rather than just Suzuka. But what is your early predictions for that race? Are we going to see another challenging Norris, or is it going to be dependent on one or two of the Red Bulls again being out of the race?
I think, like most of the races we're going to see this season, those top level results are going to depend on a bit of fortune or misfortune, I suppose, on the Red Bull side for them to become a reality. Given McLaren was so competitive in Japan last season, what was it, a double podium for Oscar and Lando last season? It was probably their best result of the season. And I don't expect McLaren to not at least believe they can get a podium on merit. I think the car is good enough and the drivers are certainly good enough to get that result, regardless of what happens with the Red Bulls or even the Ferraris. I think they could be in the mix to a certain degree. I think when you look back at the first few races and try to anticipate where that leaves them into Japan, I personally think they'll be delighted with where they are. I know there are issues with the car, especially in the slower speed corners they need to address. But as we know, Suzuka is a circuit that really rewards the high mid-speed performing cars, the ones that do the best in those situations. McLaren is up there. So they're very much going to be in their element. I suppose the only obstacle for them in that regard is the two teams that are at the moment faster than them are also going to be strong at those types of corners as well. So I think even if they finish 5th and 6th, they'll probably say, you know what, that's probably the best that we could have done without any misfortune. But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a McLaren on the podium. They've proven today, and they've proven in Jeddah as well, in particular with Piastri finishing P4 in that race, that when there are hiccups from those guys ahead of them, they're going to be there first in line to pick up the pieces. They've got Aston Martin covered. They've got Mercedes covered, which I think should be considered, as a real achievement for McLaren at this point in time. And the only way is up for them. There's more to come from them. So I'm expecting McLaren to be very strong in Suzuka as well.
Yeah, if we sort of look at McLaren's rivals, I think you're right. I think we've all sort of come to the agreement that Ferrari and Red Bull are a step ahead. Looking at the table quickly, Red Bull on 97, Ferrari on 93, and then you go down to McLaren on 55. But then, interestingly, there's another big jump. So you go down to Mercedes on 26 and then Aston Martin on 25. If we talk about those rivals, sort of the lower end, so the Mercs and the Astons, I mean, Merck had a pretty much a disaster day, didn't they, in Melbourne? Obviously, Hamilton out with a quite a weird engine issue. It just sort of immediately turned off. There was no sign at all of what was wrong with it. It just went off like a light. And then obviously Russell had the issues later on. Roy, can I ask you what you've made of Mercedes so far this year? Because they really look like a team that's stumbling into the season rather than arriving with any kind of confidence.
I mean, you said it was a nightmare day. It was a nightmare weekend. Even from Friday practice, they didn't complete the long runs like everyone else. Hamilton himself said he was messing with his head to the car. It's not been the step forwards that they wanted this car. They talked last year about we're going to completely change the design and it's going to be better, and they've just been completely caught out by what they've done really, and they're having to sort of, as Henry Kelly used to say, "I'm going for gold, play catch up to everyone else." So yeah, it's a, I'm not going to use the word shambolic because, but it's definitely not what you expect from those guys. They are, 8-time world champion, constructor team. Um, but it's just the basics sometimes seems to be going out the window. And yeah, this last lap thing from Russell as well. I mean, it's the icing on top of the cake no one wants, really. It's
And what do you reckon is behind this problem? Is it just the car? But obviously, we've got this massive story in the background that they don't know who their driver is next year. They've got a driver who's going to another team, a team that's currently doing much better. Like, I mean, I'm sure if you knew the answer, you'd be working at Mercedes with $1 million contract. But what is the main problem? Do you think? Do you think it's a car thing, or do you think it's a personnel thing?
it's personnel. They've obviously let go a lot of key personnel over the last couple of years. You look at the change at the top in terms of like the technical board. They've only just brought back James Allison, but you had Mike Elliott there who. If you read into it, apparently Mike Elliott wasn't as good a communicator as James Allison, so that's perhaps why some of their car concepts at the start of 22 wasn't really what they'd have hoped for. Based on what the simulations were saying compared to the track, but they seem to be still caught up in this problem where the simulation is saying one thing and then the track is saying the other, and it's probably the worst nightmare for any F1 team because you're using up all your resources at the factory and then you're turning up at the track and it's nothing's working as intended. F1 teams like to predict and have some sort of predictability about the way they go about business. So yeah, it's a lot of factors really behind the scenes, and it doesn't help that you don't have a confirmed driver lineup for next year. So I think there's no real team leader there at the minute. I would say as well in terms of driver wise. So
Yeah,
they got themselves into a big hole to dig out of.
If we talk about one of the drivers that is going to be there next year, and I'm coming to you on Russell. I mean, he's a driver that I personally. I mean, if we talk about McLaren, like we talk about Norris sort of being in the same category as Verstappen and Leclerc. Obviously, Norris is a few years younger, but he's sort of similar age as them. Russell's bang in that age group as well. He's 26. I think he's a few months younger or older than Verstappen. It's not that far off, but he's always seemed a driver who's got a mistake in him. And I'm thinking back to Singapore, and I'm thinking back to a few other instances, of, like with Max in Baku 2022, whatever it was during that sprint race. Is he? I mean, what kind of? It's a difficult question, but like, what level driver is he in your mind? Do you think he's the top end, or do you think he's sort of just that rung down, if you like?
It's a tough one, isn't it? Because when you look at the elite drivers, you're talking about Hamilton, Verstappen, Alonso as well. You'd probably put him in that mix. And then after that, you've got a separate category for drivers like Charles Leclerc, who almost in a weird way kind of sits on his own in that category. And then after that, you've probably got Carlos Sainz, although at the moment, the way Sainz is driving, his stock is getting higher and higher and higher. It's hard to keep him down and not consider him in that higher echelon as well. You've also got drivers like, with Sainz, you've got drivers like Lando, of course. Russell, I would probably put in there as well. But again, Russell is kind of somewhere, in my opinion, between Carlos and Lando. And the reason why I put Russell there is, as great as Lando is, and Lando's getting better and better all the time, and he's become very, very reliable as well. There's something about George that maybe he's got that win as well he's got that win. Lando hasn't quite managed that yet, although I'd argue, has Lando really ever had a car capable of winning a Grand Prix rather than winning a lottery? Probably not. Whereas George probably has at that race in Brazil that he won. So it's a hard one with George. In terms of, has he always got a mistake in him? Yeah, perhaps he does. I think for George Russell, every time Carlos Sainz wins a Grand Prix, George Russell seems to have a problem. Although in the context of today, given what we learned about the aftermath of the race with Fernando Alonso's penalty that he was given, the implication from the stewards was that wasn't Russell's fault and that he was just the consequence of Fernando perhaps pushing the boundaries a bit too much with that 400 IQ level of defensive driving. Again, I think that's a story that a lot of people are going to debate on. So, yeah, with George Russell, I would say it's a tough one, but I think he is doing a very, very good job in a car right now that is very difficult to drive. Clearly it is, because Lewis Hamilton is struggling like crazy, although maybe Lewis has switched off mentally with this and is focused on what's going to happen next year. I don't know, but it's a tough one with George. He's definitely one of the best drivers out there, but there are still a few elements to his game that I think need to be ironed out. I just don't think we're going to see that with this current brand of Mercedes car. I think the car needs to get a bit better, and then we're going to see the best version of George Russell, like we saw and hoped for when he was driving in F2 and F3.
He's got that weird statistic, George, hasn't he? Where every time Sainz has won a race, he's crashed.
Yeah,
There you go,
it's bizarre, isn't it? Like, he must be looking at signs in P1 now, and be like, please don't win, please don't win.
If Sainz becomes Verstappen, then George Russell's going to be out of F1 like that. Like,
yeah, he's never going to win a race. He's never going to finish a race again. Poor guy. Right, let's go on to a topic that I know Adam has been dying to speak about since we started recording. It's a former McLaren driver. That's how I'm going to tie it in, make it all synergy. Obviously, we're going to talk about Sainz. I mean, it's another great race from him. Like, we saw it in Singapore first, but now we've seen it here. Really, sort of a mature drive from him. Like, he's a driver that I think a lot of people probably undervalue quite a bit. I mean, when he left McLaren to go to Ferrari, I think it's probably McLaren believed more in him than Ferrari did. Really, I think Ferrari were after a driver, he fit the bill, whereas I think McLaren sort of saw him as his main guy alongside Norris. And I think ever since then, he's been a driver that's been undervalued. I think everyone accepts that Leclerc's like the best talent, the best driver that's coming up, sort of in that little bracket, probably with Verstappen and Norris as sort of like next generation champions and stuff like that. And yet Sainz has continued to do it over and over again. I mean, he won in Singapore. He's the only driver to win last year. He's currently the only driver to beat a Red Bull this year. Adam, I'll come to you first. Obviously, it's your team. Like, what did you make of Sainz in particular? We can talk about Ferrari as well if you'd like, but sort of just Sainz's drive, especially because 16 days ago he was in a hospital bed having his appendix out. Like, how impressed were you by the smooth operator today?
Absolutely incredibly impressed. Although I'm aware of where I am at the moment. So if any of your followers or listeners want to hear me rant on about how great Ferrari are and how great Carlos Sainz is, they can do so on my own show when I record that later on. I will keep it McLaren based, so that's good to know. But I think with Carlos, I mean, first things first, how much does an appendix weigh? Because clearly the weight saving he's achieved there in the last couple of weeks, there needs to be a study on this.
I looked it up. It's between 1 gram and 20 grams.
Oh, wow.
Clearly, that's the difference.
Wow.
I'm not recommending that other drivers voluntarily get their appendices taken out to get that step in performance. Of course not. But no, it was an incredible effort from Carlos Sainz under all the circumstances. The whole weekend, he's looked really good. And he's obviously been managing that issue. I mean, I'd be very surprised if he wasn't suffering with any sort of soreness or aches or even not being 100% ready for this. And yet he drove incredibly well, very assured, very comfortable, managed the race so well. And I think that is arguably his best strength, the fact that he can manage a situation like this under pressure, deliver the performance. And I think this is something that he's had his whole career. It was really honed and nurtured at McLaren in particular, because whether it be at Ferrari or at McLaren or at Renault or even at Toro Rosso, he was always touted as a driver that you could rely on and deliver good performances and be relied upon for that knowledge, that racecraft, that thing we always talk about with Fernando Alonso, that emotional intelligence behind the wheel, but never really been considered to be a driver that has the elite pace or that wow factor that his teammate would have, whether that would have been Verstappen or Lando or Charles Leclerc himself, or even not so much Hülkenberg at Renault, with respect, but when he was being replaced by Ricciardo. You know, people thought Ricciardo had that wow factor that Renault needed, that Carlos Sainz just didn't have in their eyes. And yet, time after time after time, especially when he was at McLaren, he is the guy that when you need a result pulled out of the bag, or you need to consolidate something where it's come out of nowhere and you're thinking, hold on, we could get a big result here. Carlos has always been that guy. And he's proved that today. And I'll tell you what, Sam, Ferrari, even though they're bringing in Lewis Hamilton, week after week this season, I think we're going to see Ferrari wondering, have we made the right choice here? Getting rid of Carlos for Lewis. I mean, it sounds crazy when you think about it, but on the basis of what we've seen so far, I'd be wondering if they'd worry that they've made the wrong decision here. I really would.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I actually wrote a piece this morning on exactly on that. So are they starting to have buyer's remorse? Obviously, it's Lewis Hamilton. You can understand why they did it. But Rory, coming to you, he's a driver without a seat, but surely he's going to have a drive next year, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's a thinking driver, Sainz. You know, you saw that with his win in Singapore. You know, he really has a methodical way of going about the races, and you know, even like that last, you know, it was the last couple of laps in Singapore, wasn't it, where he's asking the engineer, you know, what's the gap to Norris and to Russell, because you know he wants to try that move where he backed him up, and managed to use it was Lando as a sort of stopgap between him and the train of cars. So yeah, I think he's definitely going to have a seat next year. I mean, whether it's with Mercedes or yeah, maybe he goes to Sauber for a year before they become Audi. Yeah, I think. I mean, there was some chat over whether or not Red Bull should consider him again to replace Perez, because obviously him and Verstappen have that rapport from their Toro Rosso days. But yeah, I don't know how well that'll go down again. So, but yeah, he definitely deserves a drive on the grid for next year for sure.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Perez because it's very much similar. It's a situation that reminds me of Perez back in 2020, I think it was, where obviously he was at Racing Point. They said they're going to get Sebastian Vettel in for when they turn to Aston Martin, and suddenly Perez is without a seat. He wins in Sakir, and obviously everyone's thinking now what we're thinking of signs is surely he's going to have a seat. Surely he's going to have a drive somewhere. Adam, if you had to put your money on it, where's he going to go next year? Because like Rory mentioned, there's a lot of teams that could be interested, maybe are interested behind closed doors. We just don't know. If you had to fast forward to whatever the first day of the first race is next year, what colour, what car do you think Sainz is going to be in?
Again, it's a really tough one. Honestly, there's a whole different set of teams that he could easily be in for different reasons. It just depends on how this season is going to unfold. Will Max leave Red Bull? Unlikely. I don't see that happening despite all the controversy and everything that's going on there. Mercedes, if they weren't looking at him already, probably should do, but would Carlos want too long a term deal that would deter them from signing him? Because of course, if they do sign a driver, they're going to want someone that's going to hold that seat for a couple of years until Kimi Antonelli is ready. So I don't know if Mercedes was want to give him that longer deal, although after what they might feel Fernando did to Russell today, that may make Sainz the hot favourite for that seat now, so it could be a Mercedes. And then, of course, we have to talk about Sauber as well. Wherever Sainz goes, it's definitely going to be a downgrade in the short term to where he currently is at. If it were me, I think Toto Wolff has to pick up the phone and offer him that deal. I know they've got their money on Kimi Antonelli to be the superstar that they think he's going to be in the next few years, but I think if you chucked him in a Williams for a few years and gave Sainz 2 or 3 years at the Merc, then I think Merc would be in a much better place. Regardless of what happens, you have options. But if I was to pick right now, despite the fact you asked for a one-word answer, I've given you about 7,000. I would probably say it's probably going to end up being a Sauber unless something else happens. And I hope something else happens because I don't want to see him in a car that's not going to be competing for championships or race wins for at least 3 years from now.
When it comes to him not going to Mercedes, what's your thinking behind that? Do you think it's an optics thing where they don't want for all we've seen is was essentially a Ferrari cast off? I know that's incredibly harsh. He's won a race, he's a very good driver, but he has been rejected by Ferrari. Do you think that's probably the reason they're a bit in two minds about it?
Well, when we talked about this before, it was at the time looked like a case of they don't want Ferrari sloppy seconds. It is how that would look from them from a reputation perspective, where Ferrari have nabbed their marquee driver. And not just any marquee driver, Lewis Hamilton, and they've taken the reject in his place. And at the time, that made sense. But when you look at it now, I don't see any reason why Mercedes would not want to sign Carlos Sainz. But as I said already, I think it's not so much upsetting the apple cart, because that's what Alonso would probably do if they signed him. And I think that's why they're a bit hesitant, even though a 2-year option would work in that regard for their time frame. But it's the Kimi Antonelli factor. They wanted to bring him in that car next season. And look, Kimi's a great talent, a great prospect, but I'll be real. I do not think that kid is ready for F1, at least until maybe the year after next. I think from what we've seen so far, all right, Prema are struggling, but I don't think he's ready yet. So I think he needs a year or two in maybe a Williams or something like that to get him ready. The problem is, if Carlos goes to Mercedes, he's going to want at least 3 years like he wanted at Ferrari. He wants that long-term deal. So Carlos is in an awkward position right now where talent is not the obstacle. He's proven today, above all else, that he is good enough to drive for any team on the grid. I just don't think it fits Mercedes' timescales. I think they want a driver in there for at least a year or two so they can put Kimi in there when they feel he's good and ready. And even then, that's a risk. Carlos doesn't offer that. He wants a long-term deal. He gives you security, but I don't think Mercedes want that right now. So I think that's why they're not really looking at Carlos. But to be honest, they should be.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the problem that Hamilton had, wasn't it? He wanted a long deal, and Mercedes weren't interested for whatever reason. I think that's a story that we've heard up and down the grid. I'm thinking back to Alonso as well, where he wanted a long deal at Alpine, and they sort of hesitated and went a different way. Just for reference, Antonelli 4th today in F2, which is obviously better than last week, but still not setting the world on fire. If we move on finally to Red Bull, obviously they're a big talking point, but they're also not a big talking point because in one of their drivers didn't finish and the other one finished quite low down the order. It's a rare moment of unreliability is probably the word my tired brain is trying to think of. Roy, what did you make of it? It's not something to be worried about, I'd imagine. Like, I can't imagine they're going to go on a streak of not finishing the next 10 races. I mean, do you think it's just a momentary blip and they'll be back to their best in Suzuka?
Yeah, I mean, Verstappen didn't seem too phased by it when he was doing his sort of post retirement interviews in the media pen. So yeah, I think it's one they'll bounce back from easily. And then with Perez, of course, they had that aerodynamic issue. I think Horner described it as. So yeah, it's just a blip. I mean, they did say it would be tough to win every race this year compared to last year. So I think we're seeing that play out really. I think it's going to be. It's going to be another year where they are going to be the benchmark, of course, but then whether or not they the amount of races that they managed to win, whether or not their bests last year, because it was 21, 22 that they won, 21 races out of 22. So yeah, it's they'll bounce back from this, but it's a cause for concern, obviously, because if it's something that you can't fix overnight, or you don't know what the issue is, then it could potentially bounce back later on in the season.
Yeah, it's a shame really that we didn't see that battle, because I think it's hard to tell when Max started having his full problems, but obviously Sainz overtook him in the race. It seemed like there wasn't much wrong with him then. Like, his tyre may have been having issues, but it did look like it was set up for a very exciting race, and hopefully that will continue in Suzuka. Just before we go, I want to sort of go away from the race events, but something that's still happening is Melbourne is I think it was on Friday. You may have missed it, but Zach Brown obviously signing a new contract till 2030. I mean, for people maybe not fully aware, I mean, you probably are if you listen to a McLaren podcast, but anyway, like, he's the CEO, so I think McLaren are interesting in the way they do it. They have quite defined roles, whereas we think of like Red Bull and Mercedes, Christian Horner and Toto Wolff both do the same job, whereas in McLaren, Zach Brown as CEO, he looks after a lot of the business stuff, he looks after all of the more of the company-wide stuff, and sort of Andrea Stella does the technical side of it, really. Adam, what have you made of Zach Brown since he's come in? Because obviously, when he came in, I think it's fair to say McLaren were possibly in one of the worst periods of the history, if not the worst period of the history. I mean, the mood was unbelievably sour. Sponsors weren't interested. It's always interesting to look back at their car on the first few years that Brown was there, and it's almost completely blank. Whereas we see it this year, honestly, I get an email every week or every other day saying who McLaren's new luggage partner is or whatever. Like, they've never-ending sponsor list. Like, what have you made of Zach Brown's sort of tenure at McLaren?
I think you summed it up right there. I mean, it's the guy who's brought eyes back at McLaren for many different reasons. And look, Zach Brown is a car guy, but he's not the sort of person that you're going to expect to design and develop a car that's capable of competing in F1, let alone winning a world championship. He's not that guy, and he's never tried to be that guy. And when you come into a team that was looking in a very difficult place as long ago as it was now, to following Eric Boulier's unceremonious dismissal, and McLaren going through so many different people for so many different reasons, trying to turn their fortunes around when they were straggling at the back of the grid. It's been a long grind. It really has, not just on the track, but also in the boardroom as well. And I think there was a time last season when, and we saw this, if anyone watched Drive to Survive, you would have seen this at McLaren, where Zach was having those meetings with the shareholders, and there were questions about his position in the team. Is he capable of bringing McLaren back to where they feel they should be, like they are today, competing for podiums and even a race victory like they should be? Looking back on all of that and where McLaren were, he has done an incredible job to be the face of what has driven McLaren going forward. And I think it makes absolute sense after what has happened in the last 18 months, especially, to sign into a new longer term deal. As I said already, he's brought new sponsors to the team. He's brought eyes and ears back to McLaren. And it's a team that has a really exciting future. 10 years ago, we were all making jokes about them with the GP2 engine, like Fernando Alonso and all that stuff, and when they were struggling then, and the many years of hope and expectation and excitement, and ultimately false dawn and disappointment faced it at the end of it. McLaren have a very bright future. And I think it was Anthony Davidson, I think it was on commentary, saying, the future's bright, the future's papaya. I think that sums it up perfectly.
He's turned it back into a race team for me. If you look back, prior to before he joined, it was just a sort of luxury car, team that luxury car company that goes Formula One racing, and now it's McLaren racing again. They have the Formula E team, the IndyCar team, and the Extreme E team as well. And yeah, it's back to the roots of what McLaren was in the sort of, I want to say, what, 60s, 70s.
And I think you're right. Like he's been a very big influence on them in the past decade or however long he's been there now. But also, I think another probably factor of his job that a lot of us don't take for granted, or maybe do take for granted. Sorry, is that he's very much the public face of the team, other than the drivers. So I think that gives the like of Andrea Stella just the opportunity to work on the car. Like when something's wrong, it's Zach Brown that's going to be talking to the press. When Sky or whatever they do, like speak to a team principal, it's often Zach Brown. Like when team principals get sent to press conferences, it's Zach Brown. So that's just another part of his remit, you'd imagine, that really helps with the team. And like, I just sort of wanted to highlight some of the things he's done since he's come there, because obviously he's got drivers in like Carlos Sainz, but he's also got Lando Norris, who sort of nurtured him to one of the best drivers on the grid. He's managed to get Oscar Piastri in under the noses of a very angry Alpine, but also like on a structured kind of term. We mentioned the sponsors and stuff like that, and sort of all the other racing departments. But if you look over the past year, McLaren have been so on it when it comes to infrastructure and sort of the staff as well. Because obviously they got Rob Marshall from Red Bull, they got David Sanchez from Ferrari, but also they've got the wind tunnel back at the MTC. So I think that's probably a good example of like what Brown's doing behind the closed doors, really, or what we don't see in front of the camera. And yes, there's other people that do it. He's not doing it all on his own, but it all comes from him. And I think that's probably just an important point to highlight. And I think it's probably great news that he's staying till 2030. That gives the team a lot more stability, and sort of hopefully they can kick on from there. But that's probably all we've got time for today. I mean, that was a very good chat about the Melbourne race, considering we all woke up about 7-8 hours ago and can't remember what day it is, kind of thing. But yeah, again, my thanks go to both of you, and I'm sure we'll be back at some point in the season with the pair of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My thanks again go to both Rory and Adam for joining us, and my thanks go to you for listening along. We'll be back next week to give you your latest McLaren fix, but in the meantime, make sure you're following us on socials @PonderingPapaya, and also make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss an episode.